Okay, everyone, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Dale F. Simpson Jr. I am a board member on the Chicago Archaeological Society, and I'm very fortunate that I was asked to host this meeting today. It's a great honor to be able to introduce one of my colleagues who will be discussing and talking about the Kincaid Mounds, Dr. Tamira Brennan. However, before we get into that, I did just quickly want to discuss what is the Chicago Archaeological Society. If you have the time, we have an excellent page, our webpage that you can get a hold of us at Chicago Archaeological Society. You'll be able to see our lecture series, but a whole bunch of other features that you could use, hopefully to become a member. Membership is great. It helps us put on these awesome lectures from a variety of speakers that discuss everything from the state to the nation to the world. Our lecture series for spring is uploaded, so you can take a look at all of the cool activities that we're going to be doing upcoming, including Floyd Mansberger's chat, which we will have a accompanying article in Illinois Antiquity, which I'm also the editor. I think one of the coolest sort of discussions about the race riots of 1908 in Springfield. Then we have a lecture by Mark Adams from Fermilab about seeing inside a Maya pyramid. And then finally, we have our first, this next one in March is by only via Zoom, but April 28th and May 19th, we will have them at the Evanston Public Library, which is sort of our anchor institution. So that's a great way to come in and meet us all and meet in person before the summer begins. Um, Today's speaker is a superstar in the field, I think. She does a variety of activities employed by the Illinois State Archaeological Survey. Dr. Brennan has her PhD and MA, both from SIU down in Carbondale, and her BA at the University of U of I at UC, which is, makes sense that now she works for ISAS, which is housed down in U of I, which I also work at. So it's great to introduce my colleague. I think one of the coolest things, besides all of her work in material culture and managing our large repository and lab, she's also a great educator. And for those in the audience that are, let me bring some more people in here. For those in the audience who are interested in taking a very interesting course about curation and excavation, this summer there is a pretty cool course, and we'll put the link in the chat box if you wanted to get into it more. But it's being led by her and Sarah Foncook about how do we take archaeological materials and curate them properly in settings. This opportunity will give you some hands-on excavation experience of some simulated deposits, and then you'll learn some of the protocol to basically be able to excavate and then know what to do in a museum setting, and especially taking in all of the new sort of implementations of NAGPRA and how that affects what we do as archaeologists. So I'm sure she can introduce herself a little bit more, but it is a real pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Tamira Brennan in her lecture today, entitled Kincaid Mounds, a major Mississippian center on the lower Ohio River. So in your homes, if you can give a little internet clap, we'll let her do her thing and start the lecture.
Thank you, Dale. Let me share my screen.
Perfect.
I think you have to end your screen share, it's telling me.
Boom, there we go.
There we go. And are you seeing that okay?
I think so. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So it looks like we're all good to go. So take it away. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And I would like to thank the Chicago Archaeological Society for having me here. I don't talk about Kincaid a lot because I don't get to do a lot of work down there anymore, but I did spend a good part of my career doing far southern Illinois archaeology, including Kincaid. and some southeast Missouri right across the river, and of course, Cahokia in the American Bottom. But I always have Kincaid in my heart. It's one of my favorite sites. Kincaid is a major site, despite the fact that it's in a very rural area. And because of that, it doesn't get as much notoriety as a lot of the other mound centers. However, by number of mounds, it is the sixth largest Mississippian mound center in the United States. So it's really significant. It is about, let's see if I can advance here. Yep, it's about 200 kilometers from the American Bottom, which is where Cahokia is. So it's definitely also one of the closest large mound centers to Cahokia. And Cahokia, of course, has resounding effects on the rest of the indigenous world at the time, which is attested to by the appearance of many other mound centers and small cities and other sites, such as Kincaid, at about 1100 AD, which is about 50 years after Cahokia started. So we've got this giant new thing happening, and then shortly thereafter, down all the rivers, you see a lot of other mound centers crop up. Kincaid, however, doesn't have a lot of similarities to Cahokia outside of the Mississippian suite that we see of, corn agriculture and shell temper pottery, things like that. So despite the fact they're so close, they're not intimately trading with them as you might see at many other places. Yep. So here's where we are on the timeline. Mississippian down by Kincaid starts at about 1100 AD and it ends at about 1450. This is important because in southern Illinois, Mississippian period is the last pre-contact era indigenous population that we get. So these people actually leave, and the state is largely depopulated, and there's no longer any large Mississippian centers. And it stays that way until right around the time of European colonization. Whereas in the rest of the Mississippian world, you've got people still living there in their large mound centers up until the Spanish arrive in the 1600s. That's called the vacant quarter, so it affects easternmost Missouri to westernmost Indiana, and everywhere probably from about I-64 down. We've just got this mass exodus of people at the end of the Mississippian time period. For those of you who aren't very familiar with the Mississippian culture, we refer to the Kincaid area, sort of the Midwest, as Middle Mississippian, and it begins as early as AD 1050, and at the very latest, it's ending by the 17th century, these sort of cultural traditions, as the effects of European contact altered the demographics of the continent through disease and such. Mississippian cultures were not a single or uniform group of people, but they were many diverse communities residing across a large portion of the eastern woodlands in the eastern U.S. And they shared a suite of subsistence practices like corn agriculture, many beliefs, and they participated in a wide network that facilitated the exchange of people and ideas and things. However, if you were to go to a site in the Midwest and one in the deep Southeast, there would be a lot of different things about that. They would have different languages, different customs. Mississippian is kind of just what unified them all. They're probably most well known for the large earthen mounds they built. So unlike the preceding Hopo cultures who built many of those mounds that have the shapes of snakes and bears and other animals, Mississippian mounds were typically either conical burial mounds or rectangular temple mounds that people lived on. So they built these, and you might be most familiar with the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Cahokia because it's right off of a highway and it's easy to get to. But Kincaid, of course, is one you can visit also. You've probably are familiar with corn agriculture as a Native American thing, but it did not start until about 1050. So this was a new innovation during the time of the Mississippians, and it really changed a lot of things. Whereas previously people had to travel around, they sort of exploited the environment where they were, and they had camps and villages. Once they started doing corn agriculture, they were able to make surplus, and that allowed them to settle in one place and stay there even through the winter. And of course, surplus causes other things like, you might have an elite class because they can amass more surplus. And that wasn't necessarily something that we'd seen before. In far southern Illinois, and Kincaid is in far southern Illinois, settlement during the Mississippian period is characterized by small, dispersed, single building homesteads and multiple building farmsteads. There's very few nucleated sites, the largest of which by far is Kincaid. So in some other places, you'll have the major mound center and then a smaller mound center and an even smaller mound center and then rural villages. Around far southern Illinois, you've got the big mound center, and then you just have farmsteads sort of as satellite communities around it. Kincaid is very large. It includes over 30 known mounds, multiple flat plaza areas, such as the one that you see in the upper left-hand photo here between all the large mounds, and several iterations of a palisade that encloses it all, situated on the banks of Avery Lake. The Mississippian period occupation at Kincaid begins somewhere around 1100, about 50 years later than Cahokia, and continues till 1450, when almost everything around there was abandoned. So you can see Avery Lake here. It's about 1.6 kilometers, and it's on the northern bank of that lake. The lake itself is a remnant channel of the Ohio River. So it wasn't part of the Ohio River at the time of occupation by Kincaid, but you see a series of these remnant lakes as you get closer to the river. The natural environment here is bottomland, which is ideal for agriculture, and there were forested areas and marshy land nearby. You can see the sort of darker areas here. These are natural sloughs, so those fill seasonally with water, and they're just in there part of the site, so nobody's building their houses here. They would get flooded out. But the topography here in these lowest bottomlands are full of sloughs. Okay, so what you see here are the 31 confirmed and suspected mounds, some of which are simply low bumps where houses were built. It was a practice, we found out, that they would build these small houses. They would burn them down to the ground when they were done with them, either because they were infested with fleas or lice or mice, or for a ritual purpose. And then they would bury it with earth and build a new house right on top of the same spot, generation after generation. So that practice caused these very small mounds, which you can't see if the lander is in crops. But if it's middle of the winter and it's just grass or winter wheat, it's very easy to see these, what I call house mounds here. A dozen of the mounds, however, are large platforms that had temples and communal buildings, most of which are arranged around two separate plazas. So this is what I refer to as the main plaza. These are the largest mounds on site, and there's a big open area. Way over here on the east, there's another set of mounds and an open area in between. Altogether, these, the entirety of the site is about 70 hectares large. And then on the final outside of the site, we see just one lonely little platform mound. We call that West Mound. And the furthest one over here, we've got a burial mound. And that's outside of the palisade line. So that's kind of anomalous. So Kincaid's most notable features, aside from the mounds themselves, are that these three mound areas are spatially discrete. We typically see continuous mounds at a mound site, with the exception of Cahokia, which is singular. But here at Kincaid, we have three discrete mound areas. At the top of one of those areas is Mound 10, and that's the one you can see here. And it actually has a conical that was later built on top of the edge of it. There are a few other mound centers that have a similar thing, but excavations by the University of Chicago proved that there was what we would interpret as a chief's house on top of that conical. Today, the Massac County portion of the site is owned by ID&R. So this line right here going down, not exactly the middle, that's the county line. And everything to the west of it is Massac County, and everything to the east of it is Pope County. The eastern portion is still in private ownership, and it's actively farmed. Most of what we know about Kincaid we learned from two major research programs, which have collectively excavated at the site and its environment for over 2 decades. The first is the University of Chicago, and the second is the Center for Archaeological Investigations at SIU Carbondale. University of Chicago was once the place to learn North American archaeology, and it's attributed as the birthplace of many of today's accepted field methods. Under the direction of Fay Cooper Cole, all anthropology grad students at Chicago were required to spend a summer at Kincaid, whether they were archaeologists or not. And knowing what the summers are like down there, I'm sure that the linguists and the cultural anthropologists probably didn't appreciate it, but it was required. They were strongly for field. Some of these then new to archaeology people included Jesse Jennings, Horace Minor, Scotty McNeish, Harriet Smith, and John Bennett. John Bennett went on to begin the anthropology department at Washington University in St. Louis. And all of these names are big names in archaeology. So Chicago really birthed a lot of our important archaeologists. Even the father of American anthropology, Franz Boas, he was a friend of Fay Cooper Cole's, and he sent his identical twin grandsons out to the site for a summer when they were only 19 years old, sort of shooed them away from New York and sent them down to the swampy Black Bottom so that they could learn archaeology too. During the time that University of Chicago excavated, they pioneered many archaeological methods to meet the needs of the hot summers, digging overlapping features in hard clay. They employed what's now called the Chicago method, and that included horizontal slicing of features so that they could be seen in plan view. The bottom right-hand photo is an example of that, where they opened a broad area and looked at it horizontally. Prior to this, it was standard just to dig a deep trench and to look at everything in vertical profile and interpret it that way. So this really changed archaeology. And today, at least at ISAS, we're using that horizontal method to see most of what we see. This work laid the groundwork for our understanding of Midwestern and Southeastern sites. Chicago also hosted some of the first co-ed field schools, training North American archaeology's earliest leading ladies. These women, of course, were always chaperoned and they had separate living quarters, which presumably were slightly better than the men's living quarters that were literally on the bank of the river, and more than one of them got malaria during their time at Kincaid. This student labor was later expanded to include men employed through the Works Progress Administration as part of Roosevelt's Make Work campaign. And that resulted in large-scale excavations that uncovered deeply stratified village areas. They trenched through the site's largest mound, and they provided a framework for the ceramic chronology that we presently use to date different periods at the site. They dealt with really complex features, and they came up with very creative solutions for the novel problems that they faced. I think I'm getting one ahead. With the onset of World War II, all work at the site ceased as the labor force was diverted at home and abroad to the war effort. As a result, the findings of these 10 years of excavation, they weren't published until 1951, and the published version, in many cases, contradicts the notes of the men and women who excavated at the site, some of whom were no longer present to give their input. Although the Chicago work was a pioneering effort and it established the basis for most North American archaeology field methods today, their emphasis when they excavated was on the largest mounds at the site. And this really resulted in a bias that left us with little knowledge of what day-to-day life at Kincaid might be like. For years afterward, after Chicago left, the site remained relatively untouched and seldom visited. As I mentioned before, it's in really rural southern Illinois still today, so it wasn't a place you would just decide to go on a day trip to. And back then, the roads weren't nearly as nice as they are now. I think that rural location has really spared Kincaid. The mound centers near big cities like Cahokia, the mounds have been leveled for railroad fill or building or even agriculture, and Kincaid was largely spared that fate in the name of progress. Research at Kincaid after that long hiatus was once again initiated in the 1960s, and that included much more than the large mounds that University of Chicago studied. In 1967, Dr. John Moeller at the CAI at Southern Illinois Carbondale began a black bottom survey, and his attempt was to understand the larger economic and political system that he knew was an inseparable part of major mound centers. So he and his students surveyed nearly all of the black bottom, and they identified hundreds of sites, which allowed them to better understand the occupational history of the area beyond Kincaid itself. And he was really one of the first people to do this. Most people who were studying mound centers were only interested in the mound center, and he really broadened that out because he knew that everything outside of it was important too. His contributions to Kincaid archaeology also included acquisition of most of the University of Chicago's collections. So everything that the University of Chicago dug up at Kincaid was unfortunately put out on the dumpster at the University of Chicago when they decided to shift their focus away from Midwestern archaeology. And at the time, there weren't the type of preservation laws that would have kept them from doing it. So sort of in a panic, Glenn Black, who was at Indiana University and a Mississippian archaeologist himself, drove up with a truck to the University of Chicago and salvaged all of that stuff from the dumpster. And he had it there at Indiana University for quite some time. Then when Moeller came to SIU, Glenn Black said, "Hey, you're working on the site. Why don't you take this stuff?" So today, all of the Kincaid collections, except for a few at the ISM, live down in Carbondale. Moeller's work was followed by another research hiatus, but in 2002, the Kincaid Mound Support Organization, a local nonprofit who helped care for the site, began to clear the mounds of the trees and overgrowth within the state-owned portion of the site, and they also began efforts to pave the long gravel road to improve public access to the site. But the real thing that happened at this flashpoint in time is they planned for an interpretive viewing platform at Kincaid. In order to prepare for that, magnetic survey, a geophysical survey that was non-invasive technique, which measures the remnant magnetism in the ground, was performed in that area before they did excavations to clear it. This reopened research interest at the site, this time through the Center for Archaeological Investigations. And then more recent work includes SIU's field schools, testing and surveys from 2003 until present. The CAA work, the SIU work, is also biased. Chicago work was biased, so is CAI work, in that it necessarily focuses primarily on the Massac County portion of the site. And this is due to landowner permissions. The landowners have yielded and agree to allow some research on the easternmost portion of the site now, but it's very large scales. It's being actively farmed. However, the work done at SIU targeted a variety of different areas, including several village locales, giving us much needed data into that area. It doesn't want to let me stay on that slide. The sum of all these research programs indicate, you guys can't see that slide, sorry, I'm not sure what's going on. They indicate a local chronology that's divided into about 100-year phases. These aren't tightly defined due to a lack of a large suite of absolute dates and the absence of features that seem to date to the early phase. Those seem to be largely missing. Although there's ongoing work in the tree ring lab at Arizona State University right now that's helping to refine this through a technique called wiggle matching, where they take large sections of log, they'll radio date different rings, and then they'll say, I know this ring is earlier than that ring is earlier than that ring, and that helps tighten up the accuracy of the radiocarbon dates. Muller's survey also showed there were few sites in the preceding terminal late woodland time period near Kincaid. So the time period immediately preceding Mississippian, this wasn't a inhabited site. And then there were none dating to late woodland either. So we've sort of got an abandoned area. We know there was an archaic occupation at Kincaid. And if you see this anomaly right here, that's what that is. And then people kind of got lost and they came back later. So it appears then that Kincaid grew in situ out of a large, it didn't grow out of a large incumbent late woodland population, which was the case at some Mississippian centers, but it was newly established as a settlement by settlers from other nearby areas. The recent research that's made the most significant impact on our understanding of the site, however, was the magnetic survey completed by Clay, Hargrave, and Peterson and published in a 2011 article in Southeastern Archaeology. I believe Brian Butler was the lead author on that. And the results of this survey revealed much denser occupation than was previously thought and in unexpected areas of the site, which boosted our previously conservative population estimates, revealed the site structure, and it definitely piqued our archaeological interest. So most of the state portion, as you can see here, has been surveyed, where only small areas of the private land have. And then, of course, the low areas, the sloughs, those seasonally hold water, and they were considered very low probability, so they were left unsurveyed. This close-up shows the outlines of many house basins. So all of these black dots that you see here, we would propose that those are buildings. And we've tested them and found out that's true. So if you were to look at the entire map of the site, you would see hundreds of buildings. And of course, we don't know which of these buildings were earlier and later, if they were contemporaneous. So magnetometry does have its limits, but it's certainly eye-opening to give you a bigger view of the site. So from those images, when I was still in grad school, I attempted to identify all the structures visible in that survey, which was about 123. And of course, these aren't an accurate reflection of house size because the depth of those features below the soil can affect the size of the magnetic anomaly. But excavation of several indicate that they're pretty close. One of the most significant things that was revealed in the MAG survey was a previously unknown occupation at the site. So in this circle here, this is West Mound, and you can barely see it as a small bump right there. Not only did archaeologists never suspect that there were houses there, the limits of the site even excluded it at the time. But the mound was thought to be historic because when it floods, farmers would park tractors up on it and it was pretty low. It's not, of course, we excavated there and proved that it was a mound, and we tested some of those things that look like houses, and they are. The reason that no one had ever known that there were features there is because we'll do that with walkover surveys. Someone will plow the site, and then we'll just walk over it and pick up artifacts, and no artifacts had ever been picked up there. It turns out that all the houses there are buried under more than a meter, more than 3 feet of alluvial deposits. So there are often floods at Kincaid. It's not in a leveed area, and soil had been repeatedly deposited there, so much that it buried the archaeological features well below the area that the plow would pull things up. The presence of this mound and the occupation that surrounds it is significant because it's physically and visually set apart from the site, and it only spans about 100 years of the site's 350 years of occupation, from about 1200 to 1300. There's differences in the ceramics and lithics found here as compared to the rest of the site, which indicates the community is probably not an expansion of the growing site population, but that it represents a group of immigrants coming to the site and settling there. Here's a close-up of it. You can see there's potential courtyard-like arrangements of structures here, which is unique to Kincaid. The other areas don't have that arrangement. And there's this keyhole-style hearth you see in the picture on the lower right. And other hearths at Kincaid are clearly square. They're made of puddled clay. So this is a very different hearth style. And that's pretty important because there wasn't a lot of variety in the way people did things back then. It's not unheard of that large Mississippian centers might be composed of multiple groups of people with different origins, but it's pretty unusual they should continue to practice those different traditions well into their occupation at that site. Usually they kind of assimilate. Large Mississippian settlements are very effective at assimilating diverse cultures in a way that makes them almost invisible within a short time. Cahokia, for example, presents biological evidence that about 30% of the population were immigrants. You would never know that by looking at the material culture or the architecture on site. In fact, at Cahokia, the homogeneity of their things is so striking that that sort of biological revelation was a big one. So this West Mound community, as I said, it's short-lived. It was abandoned by the late phase at the site, while the population within the core area actually grew. It's possible that that West Mound community drew inward into the core area and continued to receive protection of the palisade as it contracted, and thereafter took up, the same architecture and ceramic practices as everybody else at the site, thus becoming invisible to the archaeological eye. Or it's possible that after that 100 years, they went back to the cultures from which they came. We tested other houses that were predicted from the magnetometry, not only to verify that they were in fact buildings, but also to get a handle on what time phases were represented there. So in 2009 and 2010, I led an SIU field school and Southeast Missouri University field schools at Kincaid at several of the locations. The materials, field notes, maps, and all of these from previous SIU and UC digs allow me to compare between community areas to kind of see what was going on there. So I compared the size and function of structures, the daily activities of the residents, and who outside of the Black Bottom they were interacting with through trade, and approximately when they lived. So here's one example of a house we excavated. This one's in the main plaza with the large mounds, and it's a really nice example of both the benefits and limitations of that magnetometry. As you can see from the map of the house, in reality, it's a very close match to the magnetometry in the upper right hand of the screen. So here we've got a hearth, and there it is. And these wall trenches are making a really nice square. We put our units right over it, and there it was. What we could not see, however, was that this wasn't just one house, it was two houses, and it had been rebuilt. It had two hearths, it had two sets of wall trenches, and the magnetometry can't really tell us that. It also can't tell us what we're going to find in the feature. In this case, what we found was pretty spectacular. This house was catastrophically burned, meaning that its residents did not have time to clear out its contents, and there were many complete pots and other artifacts on the floor. Most of the houses at Kincaid, they emptied them out, then they burned them, but in this case, we know that they weren't expecting the fire they got. So some of the things we found on the floor, we found 8 complete vessels, a large flat pigment abrader, ceramic figures, and other things. And when I was teaching this field school, I really made a liar of myself because we found one of these whole pots. And I said, all right, students, mark this day. Never in your life will you find another whole pot again. And then we found 7 more. So I was happy to be a liar, but it was really an exceptional experience, I think, for everybody who was there. In the same season that we excavated that house, we looked at two other predicted houses, and these ones don't look quite as good. You can see this guy here and this guy here. And it turned out that one of those was, in fact, a house. And the smaller one was just kind of a palimpsest of random features and deposits. So it's one of those ones I'd say we unsuccessfully predicted that there was a house there. And these turned out to be very close to the ground surface. You can see here, this person is standing at the level of the feature. So really we've just got the plow zone, which has probably destroyed parts of the feature, and they're immediately below the surface. One thing that this told us was that a lot of the features that are showing up in magnetometry are the later features at the site. So this early component we're missing from the site, maybe because we don't know where to target, we can't see them in magnetometry. And then the second house we tested in 2010 was immediately adjacent to the site's palisade. So this is some kind of plow scar, but this line here is actually the palisade of the site, and this is a bastion. And many of these bastions actually have not been plowed because they're in a wood line. So this is sort of an open part of the field, but it's still very striking how clear the palisade is. And these bastions are about every 30 meters. But what we were targeting here was this very clear feature and this one too. And here's the very clear feature right there. It was in fact a house. However, there was another feature on top of it that we really couldn't predict from the magnetometry. And there's what it looks like, the portion we excavated. You can see there's a ton of daub in there. So these houses are very heavily daubed. They would take the clay soils, they would pack them probably all the way up the side of the house, which wasn't very far from the ground surface because these are semi-subterranean features. You would have to step down to get into the house. So they would pack that on, it would get hard. And then when they dismantled their house, they would throw everything inside and burn it. And we get this very difficult to dig clay within there. And there's a nice pot. That's this guy here. So they're also throwing their trash in there. That's not a complete pot, but they'll throw things in as they burn it. So altogether, let's see where we are here. Altogether, the magnetometry and the test excavation show that beyond the middle Kincaid occupation of West Mound, the late Kincaid community was more compact. So here we have, say, 1100 when West Mound is here. And this is the palisade line, which we can see in magnetometry, with exception of a few spots where I've got dash lines there. But then later on, the palisade was rebuilt, and that includes a much smaller area. The main plaza area here was much more complex after that. So a lot of the mound building is also happening after this restricts. And at this time period, which is a little after 1200, nobody lives around West Mound anymore. So they made the site smaller, not necessarily fewer people, but perhaps there's reasons, probably warfare, to be more compact. Also happening during this time period, artifacts become more similar to each other. So previously you would look at the artifacts in different site areas and say, these are pretty similar, but they have more bowls over here, or they're tempering their pots a little differently over there. Once we get to Lake Kincaid and everybody's close to each other in the center, all the artifacts look almost the same. And that's kind of expected. And then here's a view of the largest mound at Kincaid, Mound 10. Chicago's limited excavations there indicate this was probably not all one monument throughout time. It was probably two or maybe even three smaller monuments at the head of the plaza. And then these were later combined into one mound, either as one group gained sway or other groups merged. So a lot of times a mound might be commissioned or built by everybody, or it might be representing, say, a clan or a group. So this could represent one of two things. You've got the groups banding together, and this monumental act is one to make them more cohesive, or you've got a group coming into more power, and they are obliterating the memory of those other one or two groups by covering over their mounds and making it part of their own. We can't really know which is the case here. But if it were the second case where you're obliterating it, that's sort of forgetting history, like it's a social memory thing. So it's the forced forgetting of history. So latest in the site sequence, a conical addition was placed on this mound, which had an earthen staircase winding up its side, and it was topped by a small structure ethnographic evidence suggests that would have been the home of the leader of Kincaid. And it doesn't look like a temple. We do have temple mounds. The temples are very clearly huge, overbuilt buildings. And this one looks more like somebody's house. What occurred at this time or before the eastern side of the site is a large mystery. So this is the area we have very little that we know about it. This burial mound was excavated down to the ground, so we know it had burials in it and it was very small. There have been no large excavations into these. There have been some in this village area here, which shows pretty much the same things we see on the western side of the site. Like West Mound, the people living at the eastern fringe may have represented a separate group, presumably more successful than West Mound since they have many and larger mounds, though we can't say whether or not they were more enduring. This area is a good candidate, perhaps, for early Kincaid habitation, which we're missing. But what is clear is that the burial mound was used throughout the site's history, so that does date from early Kincaid all the way to late Kincaid. Despite the limitations on what we know about the site, examining the physical layout and its particular ways in which people created and interacted with their world through time really helps us to understand the history of Kincaid and therefore the pre-contact history of the Mid-South. At the very end of Kincaid's life, we start to see more sites pop up in the uplands around Kincaid and more important sites. For example, if you're from Southern Illinois, you may know of Millstone Bluff in the Shawnee Forest, and it's a large hilltop Mississippian site, and then smaller ones as well. So we're not sure if it was a very rapid depopulation at 1450 or if people were sort of bleeding out of the site and establishing these other things around Kincaid at that time. But what we do know is that shortly after 1450, Kincaid and all of the sites around it were no more. And who the Mississippians are, for us, is somewhat of a mystery. Of course, there's 30 indigenous tribes who call Illinois their ancestral home, and it was likely more than one of them. So among them are the Miami, Peoria, Osage, the Quapaw, who are down in Arkansas now. And these people were very mobile. And of course, over the course of time, they went in many directions. So we can anticipate, especially as we get into the new Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, that we'll see a lot more connection to Kincaid from the indigenous groups who created it. That's all I have to say about Kincaid at the moment, but of course, I would love to answer any questions that you might have.
Outstanding. Thank you very much. Always an interesting place. I always like the discussion too. Just not only does it tell us about our Mississippian and sort of earlier ancestors, but also a lot of the archaeological ancestors of Illinois to show just some of these keynote folks that were down there. And I did not know about, and I think you had mentioned, and I forgot about Boaz's, grandson going there and getting, sieving is where you build character, right? This is where
Yeah, I
you
don't know if
actually,
they were being punished or
yeah,
if
right.
it was a
Yeah,
treat. I'm not sure which.
they were acting poorly in school, and well, you know
Yeah,
what? You're gonna go sieve for the summer. Good luck. So that's great. What I'll do is I think I've got a couple questions that have come in, but maybe the best thing would be if you have a question you like in specifically, maybe you can chuck it into the chat box. Make sure it's going to the whole group. Please be professional in that chat box as well. But I did have an earlier question from the audience, and I will just get to this one. It was about, and you sort of touched on a little bit, what happened to the people of Kincaid after the 1500s? What you touch, maybe you can just sort of, what are the points of emphasis, or, did they collapse? Did they disappear? What happened to them?
sure. I think there's a lot of factors going on. So around 1450, well, actually earlier than 1450. So in the 1300s, there are a lot of severe droughts in short order. So we've got data from, say, lake cores and things like that, especially around Cahokia. It's interesting because Cahokia sort of collapses sooner. It's done. It starts to decline in the 1300s and it's done by 1400. And of course, that's going to have a huge effect on all of the sites within its network. But there's these sequences of droughts that really aren't sustainable for amassing the type of surplus that you would need to amass to keep a place like Kincaid or Cahokia going. So we've got all of these droughts. We also have some pretty significant celestial events. There's comets and there's eclipses, and we've got a significant earthquake from the New Madrid Fault. So that's, of course, going to be a terribly frightening thing. Back then you don't know what an earthquake is, and all of a sudden the ground beneath you is falling away. So it's the elite who are in charge of making sure it keeps raining and the ground isn't shaking and the sun isn't blotted out. And all of these things are happening kind of around the same time that people probably got a very, very bad feeling about the area, in addition to being hungry because they're running out of corn. And of course, they came from many different places, especially at Cahokia. So many of them are probably returning to their homelands, their ancestral homelands. Others might just be deciding, we're going to get out of here. This is not, this is not the place that it was when we came. There's a deficit of food. It keeps being hot. So it was significant enough, whatever was happening, that it happened all throughout Southern Illinois and parts of Indiana and Kentucky and Missouri. And if you talk to some of the indigenous tribes today, they have tribal historians, and they will tell you we came from Illinois. So they have oral histories that say, yeah, we were in Illinois and then we left. And each of them may have different reasons or points in time that they say they left. But I think it's sort of a conglomeration of, religious and environmental factors.
Very cool. Another one from the Facebook Live was what style? I'm assuming he's talking about lithics here. What style do Kincaid artifacts fall under? Like Braden, Hightower, and then Schwegmans. I'm to be honest, I'm not aware of those particular lithic cultures. Could you just sort of highlight a little bit of that?
Sure. I think Braden and Hightower, I'm familiar with the Braden plates, so these copper repoussé plates from, I think, Missouri, if I'm correct. And there's the Hightower phase. Those aren't phase names that we use in Southern Illinois, just because archaeologists can't seem to get on the same page about phase names. You go 2 hours away, and it's a whole different set of phase names like Braden and Hightower. But their lithics were very consistent with what we would find throughout Illinois and Southeast Missouri and Indiana. They've got an expedient flake tool technology. So almost all of their tools are just expedient flakes. Knock something off and use it as a knife. They have Madison points, which were for bow and arrows, and they're not called Madison everywhere, but that's what we would call them there. They're very simple triangular small points. And then sort of the cooler stuff, the bigger stuff, they've got the hose, the agricultural tools they're making out of Mill Creek. And Mill Creek specifically is what you make these out of most of the time. That source and that sort of material, it's really good for hose because it's durable. It's not going to chip a lot, but also it means something that it came from Mill Creek. So they're sort of following the style of Illinois to the north, but we also see a lot of Dover chert. And Dover's coming from Tennessee and areas south. So they've got a lot more interaction with the central Illinois River Valley, say south of Thebes Gap, which is sort of at the confluence of the river area, Missouri and Illinois, or Ohio and Illinois. I can't get it. Mississippi and Ohio River confluence. So they're interacting more with those cultures than they are to the ones north of them. And I think their style is somewhere in between what you'd see at Cahokia and what you'd see at, say, Wycliffe or one of those more southern mound centers.
Outstanding. We still got some time here, so I like getting the audience participation from the similar gentleman, Mike. Questions about if Millstone Bluff was that part of some refugee site, perhaps for Kincaid? And then on a parallel, he sent a petroglyph photo of, I'm not too sure, a turkey or a thunderbird. And it says that the three button motifs that you see at the petroglyphs from Millstone, do you see any of those at Kincaid? So sort of a double up question there. One, was Kincaid a refugee site for Kincaid's at Millstone Bluff? And is there any connection to the petroglyphs between the two sites?
Sure. Millstone, it's such a good defensive place. So anyone who's not familiar with Millstone, it's this natural stone peak, and if you're far away from it, it looks like a mound. So that's really cool too. But it's a little bit of a hike to get on top of it, and you can, and I recommend you do because it's in the Shawnee Forest and it's wonderful. So its location is perfect for refugees. However, all of the rock art up there suggests that that's probably not what it was. You know, they had cedar poles up there in the center of their plaza, and they had a pretty lively community, and there's burials. And I think more it's more of a really important and enduring sacred place that just happens to be at its peak of occupation towards the end of Kincaid. As far as the petroglyphs go, Kincaid doesn't have any petroglyphs, and there's very little lasting artifacts at Kincaid because the soil's so acidic. So the things where we would see those sort of motifs would be ceramics, and most of the ceramics have very badly eroded surfaces. The Thunderbird motif itself, however, is sort of pan-Mississippian and even dates to earlier periods. So certainly Kincaid would have known what that meant and been familiar with it, and potentially even made pilgrimages to Millstone Bluff just to view that rock art.
Some feel good comments. This was the first mound group I ever visited from Timothy, so that's cool. Some people when they're exploring archaeology for the first time, maybe that motivated them. So I thought that was quite cool. And then someone else with the feel good. Thank you for this presentation. I learned a lot about the site. I visited on a road trip in December 2022, and it was a beautiful experience. I'm taking archaeology at my local university in Springfield, Missouri, and learning about Franz Boas. So it's great to tie into someone I just learned about it. I appreciated it. So
Excellent.
you got some touchers there. Here are
Great.
some more questions. A simpler one, I think. What temper do you see in the pottery at Kincaid?
In the Mississippian time period, it's 99% mussel shell. So they would get, mussel shells are abundant on the Ohio. They would burn them and then crush them and put them in there. And throughout Illinois, Mississippian, at least below Cahokia, it's all shell. The only exception I would say is in their finest wares. You know, they'll have some serving wares like these beakers that are like cups they drink out of, and really nice plates that they make. They will also temper those with grog, which is crushed up pottery. So there's something about the fine weather where whether it's technical or social, they're using shell and grog for those.
Outstanding. Longtime supporter of CAS, Mark Strong writes, how do you determine that houses are occupied for many generations?
The houses themselves probably didn't last that long, especially somewhere like the Black Bottom where it's extremely humid and they're using wood poles. So ethnographic examples and the number of years that wood lives say a house is only going to last like 12 to 16 years before they have to rebuild it. So what I was referring to there with especially with these house mounds is that they pull it up, they burn it, and they bury it, and they build one in the same place for generations. And we know that because we'll see the footprint of this house. And when they rebuild it, they usually offset it just a little bit, like a foot or two. And then it gets burned and buried, and then they make another one and offset it. So what we'll see is 4, 5, 6 sets of walls all superimposed on one another that are indicating, multiply that by 12 years, you've got a couple generations in a row in the exact same spot.
Outstanding. Just two more. I think this one's coming straight from Space Odyssey from Hale 9000. You seem very confident in stating earthquakes and celestial events mattered and why Kincaid was abandoned. What evidence is there to support that idea?
Well, we know that they watched the sky and had an understanding of the seasons from the stars and things. There are some motifs in Mississippian time period that a lot of archaeologists have argued have to do with celestial events. So, for example, one of them is called the forked eye, and many people propose it's like the eye of a kestrel. So it's sort of like this. But also, when you look at Halley's Comet, it almost looks like it has two tails. So a lot of people have proposed that that's Halley's Comet. Another one is that a lot of the pottery will have a restricted rim, and then sort of the inside of the rim is slipped with red. And that looks somewhat like the corona of a solar eclipse. But also it's very it could be drawing lines, but there's certain things that happen like Cahokia at 1050. Well, 1050 was an important solar event. And then there was a giant New Madrid earthquake about 1450. So these things are really lining up. And of course, no one can say for certain, but people have gone back in time to determine when solar events happen or celestial events, when earthquakes happen, things like that, when droughts happened. And they're all kind of lining up at really important points in Mississippian history.
Outstanding. Sort of in that same vein about the celestial events is mound alignments and arrangements. Is there any continuation of them beyond the ceramics, or perhaps petroglyphs or whatnot, looking how mounds would also be orientated?
Yeah, there's a lot of work on the orientation of mounds to, say, a lunar maximum or something like that. I haven't done any of that myself. I know those exist for angel mounds, for emerald mounds, for Cahokia mounds, and I think someone's made a comment on Kincaid mounds. But they certainly were well aware of, the paths of the stars, and it's no coincidence in many cases that their mounds are lining up with those things. I won't make an official comment on Kincaid because I haven't looked at that myself.
Right on. And then the last question, I think is perfect segue to leave, is about the remote sensing itself. How long did it take you to do that huge remote sensing survey a few years back? And are you looking to do more with newer technologies?
That took a couple years because it was all done by volunteer. They were called the Three Magneteers. So Burley Clay, Mike Hargrave, and John Schwegman Sr. had three magnetometers. And when they were all available, everybody who could volunteer would go down and set up grids, and they would spend 2 days in a row doing it. So it actually happened over the course of several years and was eventually published in 2011. And it was a huge area to cover. That's a lot of walking. Um, as far as whether people will do something in the future, that magnetometry data is really good. It looks really good. So I doubt that unless there's technological advances in magnetometry itself, that they would redo a mag survey. But there are other technologies. They've tried ground penetrating radar and another one down there, and they didn't really work well with those soils. So as they improve those other technologies, I could say that yes, I wouldn't be surprised if someone went out there to do additional survey in the future.
I think I will call it at that. You got rammed with 8 questions there, which is quite exceptional for a chat like this. Everyone, if you can, just give Dr. Brennan a internet clap for her outstanding work.